welcome those of you who are here in person, and we're welcoming those who join us online. We are studying together the life of David. We actually started with, I wanted to give you some context. So we started with Eli and Eli's two wicked sons, and then we got to Samuel, and God gave Eli a second chance to raise a son, and he raised Samuel wonderfully. Samuel's one of those guys that at the end of his life, he stood up and he said, did I steal anybody's ox? Did I steal anybody's donkey? Did I rob anybody? Did I take a bribe? And everybody said, no, you never did that. He's just one of the great men of the Bible. He's also one of the only guys who had all three positions for Israel. He was the high priest, he was the prophet, and he was also the judge, the military judicial judge. And so he held all of those offices. But as he got old, Israel looked around at all the bordering nations, and they sound a little bit like, you remember your kids when they came in and they said, can I go to the movies? And you said, no, I don't think so. And they said, but Johnny's going to the movie, and Bobby's going to the movie, and Billy's going to the movie. And this is what Israel sounds like. They're like, well, the Philistines have kings, and the Edomites have kings, and the Egyptians have kings. Oh, please, can we have a king? Well, they had a king. They had King Jesus. But they rejected him, and they wanted a human king. And so Samuel anointed Saul. Saul started well. I don't know how long the good start lasted, maybe a year, maybe two. But it just turns into his own selfishness and his own ego, and with his power, he just started becoming arrogant, and he also, along the way, became unsure of himself and jealous, and you can tell he suffers from low self-esteem. He's just got all these issues that he won't trust God with, and so God sends Samuel to anoint a new king, and he anoints David. And David is anointed in a private ceremony. This isn't a coronation. In fact, Saul doesn't even know that Samuel has done this, but he has anointed David. David's not Jesse's firstborn son or his secondborn son or his thirdborn son. He's the youngest. He's the youngest, and he's the one that has to go and take care of the sheep and do the most menial jobs. Well, Saul's fighting Philistines, and on one occasion, the Philistines send out their best warrior, a giant of a man named Goliath. And he comes out in the valley between the two armies, and every morning and every evening he says, why should we all fight? Send me one guy down here. We'll just fight mano a mano, man to man. If he kills me, we'll be your slaves. If I kill him, you be our slaves. And nobody from the Israelites will go down and fight him. Not Abner, the general, not Saul, the king. Nobody will go and fight him. And on the 81st time, the 40th day, that Goliath goes out and he makes this challenge, David shows up with a care package from the family. And last week, we finally got to David, in the life of David. We finally got to David, and David has this moment that everybody knows about. People who've never read the Bible know this story. We know the story of David and Goliath, and David kills Goliath. He doesn't even have a sword in his hand. He's not wearing any armor. He's got a rock in his slingshot, and he lets it fly, directed by the Spirit of the Lord, right there, and Goliath goes down, he runs up, cuts off his head. Israel is immediately empowered. They rush at the Philistines. The Philistines turn and run away for their lives. And from that day on, David is a celebrity. Literally, it's the day that changes everything in his life. By the time the army gets back to the capital, the women come out in the streets, they have a ticker tape parade, and they're singing a song, and the song says, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul decides right then he's got to get rid of David. And now David's going to be running for his life, not only from the Philistines, but also from Saul as well. In the middle of that, God does something for David that is remarkable, and yet It's kind of an everyday thing. It's miraculous, but it's mundane. God gives David a friend. God gives David a friend who happens to be one of the greatest guys in the Bible. Everybody in this room would like to have a friend like Jonathan. And today, I want you to join me in 1 Samuel chapter 14. And we're going to take our Bible study time this morning just to talk about Jonathan and what kind of guy he was and what kind of friend he was. And I want you to see Jonathan's, he's a supporting character in the Bible, right? So he's one that not a lot of people really know much about. And yet at the same time, how many of you guys in the room, either your first name or your middle name is John or David? Could I see your hands? How many of you have kids who their names are John or David? See, anybody in the room have a kid or a grandkid named Goliath? Could I see your hands? No. We don't name our kids Goliath. It's kind of like we don't name our daughters Jezebel. You don't meet that gal very often, right? But Johns and Davids are plentiful. In fact, Jones in ancient English is Johns, and it just became Jones. And after a bunch of our ancestors stole some horses and got thrown in prison, the names changed, right? So, I'm not Johns, I'm Jones. That's what my dad told me when I was tracing my lineage. I said, who are our ancestors? He said, horse thieves. So that's as close as we ever got to royalty in our family. So Jonathan, John, is one of these names that, now remember what we're reading is 3,000 years ago. And everybody in the room knows a John, they know a David, and this is one of the great friendships of history. So I want you to see a little bit about Jonathan. That's what the study that we're going to do today. You've got 1 Samuel chapter 14. We're going to look at quite a few passages because we're just going to kind of bounce through 1 Samuel here, and I want you to see this guy. So here's one of the stories, 1 Samuel chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. One day Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come and let's go over to the Philistine garrison that's on the other side." But he didn't tell his dad. He didn't tell his dad because his dad wouldn't go. There's another part of this story that's really incredible. His dad wouldn't go. His dad was afraid to go. And his dad actually went and got the grandson of Phinehas, who was the son of Eli, and he had him bring the Ark of the Covenant to the battleground. Now let's just, everybody in this room remembers this story. I just told it a few weeks ago. Eli had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They took the Ark of the Covenant into battle with the Philistines because they thought it would give them superpower, like Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of mythology, and it didn't. They all got killed, and they lost the Ark of the Covenant for a whole long period of time. It is just 2 generations later that Saul has Phinehas, who was killed in that battle, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. He has his grandson, who is a priest, and he says, "Bring the Ark of the Covenant so we can go into battle with it." You need to teach your kids and grandkids history. If you don't teach them history, they'll say something really brilliant to you like, "I think we should be a socialist country." Let me tell you about the history of that. It's never worked, not once. In all of history, it's never worked. You don't have to be a Bible student to know that. You just have to know history. Saul is about to mess up again. But Jonathan leaves them, and he goes and he takes this fight on. So here's what he does, and I'm not going to take the time to read the middle passage. There's a place up in the rocks where there's a rock on this side and a rock on this side, and there's a mountain pass. And up there in the mountain pass, because of where the rocks are, there's not room except for like one horse, one donkey, or maybe 2 guys, shoulder to shoulder, to walk through between the rocks of this mountain pass. And the rocks go up to where there's a garrison. So this is where this story takes place. So So in verse 6, Jonathan says to the young man who carried his armor, he said, come and let's go over to the garrison, it's up in the rocks, of these uncircumcised Philistines. It may be that the Lord will work for us. Here's a great phrase to underline in your Bible. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. Look at that phrase. I want you to see here the faith of Jonathan. And I'm just going to start writing all kinds of characteristics of this guy. But the faith of it is he knows the Lord can do this. Now, there's only two of them, by the way. It's Jonathan and his armor bearer. It's just two of them. But he says, the Lord can save with a lot of people or even hardly anybody. And the armor bearer, who clearly loves Jonathan, says to him, do all that's in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul. So these guys, they love each other. They're good guys. They fight together. They trust each other. They're in this all the way. And we see Jonathan as a friend to the armor bearer, even before we get to the friendship that we're going to talk about, which is with David. And so Jonathan says in verse 9, he says, okay, here's the plan. If they say to us, wait until we come down to you, then we'll stand our place and we won't go up. But if they say, come up here, and then we know that the Lord is going to give them into our hands. We'll go up, and the Lord's done this for us. It'll be a sign for us. So they showed themselves to the garrison. Next thing I want you to see here is that he's brave. So he purposely reveals himself to the Philistines that are up there. And they showed themselves, and the Philistines said, oh, look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they've been hiding themselves. And the men of the garrison, they yell. So Jonathan's down the mountain, they're up the mountain, and between them is the narrow rock of the pass. And so the men of the garrison, they yelled at Jonathan and the armor bearer, and they said, come up here and we'll show you a thing or two. Literally, it means we'll teach you a lesson. That's the phrase we would use. Come up here and we'll teach you a lesson. And so Jonathan says to the armor bearer, that's the sign. That's the sign. That's what we know. God's with us. And armor bearer's with him 100%. So Jonathan and the armor bearer, they go up there and they climb. Verse 13, it's so steep that they climb hands and feet. That's what they mean. It's so steep that they have to all fours to climb up this. And so they get up there. And when they do, in the first strike, Jonathan and his armor bearer, they kill 20 men in the length of that passage. So you say, well, how does a guy kill 20 men? I mean, now Jackie Chan can do it, but how do you do 20? Well, the answer is there's not room for the Philistines to come except almost one at a time. And so he's literally fighting. We don't know how long the passage is that's narrow. But he's fighting through the passage, but the Philistines can only fight him one at a time, and he kills them. And the passage goes on to say, he kills them or wounds them, and then the armor bearer comes behind and literally it says, finishes them off. So this story of David is more of a guy story than a girl story. Sorry, ladies, but there's just a lot of great stuff in here that's like Braveheart. So this is what they're doing all the way through here, and this is our first story about Jonathan and the kind of guy that he is. Turn with me to chapter 18, and I'm sorry I want to move so quickly here, but there's so much I want you to see. So chapter 17 is where we were last week. David kills Goliath. When he kills Goliath, Saul says to his commander, Abner, he says, who is that kid? And he goes, I don't have, for the life of me, I don't know. So he goes back and they have a conversation. Chapter 18 says this, as soon as David had finished talking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. It's a very unusual phrase. The only other place that you read this imagery of hearts, souls being knit together is literally in the marriage relationship. It's very unusual phraseology that their souls were knit together, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took David from that day, never let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. We've read this phrase 3 times in 3 verses. So the writer of the Bible here wants us to know what kind of relationship this is. And David stripped himself of his robe that was on him. It would have been a royal robe. Be reminded of who Jonathan is. Jonathan is Prince Jonathan. King Saul, Prince Jonathan. He's next in line to be king. His robe would have been a royal robe. He strips his robe that was on him, and he gave it to David, and he gave him his armor and his sword and his bow and his belt. Now, once again, ladies, sorry for this, the guys will get this. These are his most prized possessions. An ancient bow, a long bow, that's your bow. You know how it shoots. You know if it's high or low. You've practiced and practiced. You don't just pick up a bow at Shields. The sword would have been made for the prince. It would have been weighted just for him. He wouldn't have just gone down to the blacksmith and picked out something off the shelf. He's a prince. His stuff would have been the best stuff in Israel, and he's a warrior. We've just read the story how he alone kills 20 Philistines. He's a warrior, and he gives all this to David. I want you to see some things here about Jonathan. I want you to see that Jonathan picked his friends. Let me talk about that just for a little bit. Some of us, the friends that we have are just the friends that we have by circumstance, or the people that we fell in with. Jonathan has acquaintances that he knows because of circumstance and because of happenstance, but Jonathan picked his friends. Jonathan, literally what you're reading in chapter 18, he chose David. David didn't really choose him. David didn't have a right to choose him. David couldn't say, I want to be friends with the prince. You don't get to do that. Jonathan picked him, and then we also discover that Jonathan loved him. It just says it over and over and over again. He loved him. He loved him as his own soul. Their souls were knit together. And then also, Jonathan is a giver. And we might even say a sacrificial giver. He doesn't give David like, hey, I've got 2 swords. Let me give you my spare sword. That's not how the story goes. Takes it off of him. He's been in battle, and he gives him the best stuff that's just better than anybody else except maybe Saul has got in all of Israel. And this is a part of that story about who they are and what happens with them. And the scripture finishes in verse 5, and David went out, and he was successful wherever Saul sent him. Well, they're going to come back from this thing, and it's literally down in verse 7 where the women come out in the parade, and they say, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s, and at that time, Saul just gets so mad. Look at verse 8. Saul was very angry. It displeased him. He gets all mopey. So verse 12, Saul is afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence, and he made him a commander of 1,000. David went in and came out from among the people, and David had success in all of his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. In verse 15, when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of David. Now, he should be rejoicing, but he's trying to compete with him. And so it says, but all of Israel and Judah loved David. So Saul's going to try a series of things here. He's going to make him a commander of thousands, and he's going to send him out to battle all the time, hoping the Philistines will kill him. And then that doesn't really work. So then he says, you know what? He goes, I'm going to let you marry my oldest daughter. And David says, I don't have anything for a dowry. I got nothing. I'm the 7th son of a sheep herder of Bethlehem. And Saul goes, no, he goes, you kill 100 Philistines, and that'll be the dowry. And David goes, really? So David kills 200. And then he marries her off to somebody else. And they do this thing back and forth. Well, finally in chapter 19, Saul has decided he's going to kill David himself. And I want you to see that because what we're studying today is Jonathan, I want you to see that Jonathan, let me see if I can say this well. Jonathan's not just a good friend only to David. You see, when you have these kind of characteristics in your life, when your faith is strong, when you love people, when you're brave, when you're a giver, when you know how to vet people, see people, you know what character looks like, Jonathan can't help but be a good friend. He's such a good person, he can't help but be a good friend. So believe it or not, what we're going to read in 1 Samuel 19 is Jonathan actually being a good friend to his father. He's going to share some advice with his dad that his dad doesn't want to hear. But because Jonathan is a good son, because he's a good person, because he walks with the Lord, he's going to speak truth. And I want you to see how this happens. And so chapter 19, verse 1. Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all the servants that they should kill David. So it comes as an edict from the king. If the king tells you to do it, it's got to do it. But the next phrase says, but Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. He loves David. He's no way he's going to kill David. And so Jonathan and Saul are going to have a conversation. It comes out of the character, the integrity of who Jonathan is, even though he knows his dad is messed up. Here's how it goes, verse 4. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and he said, let not the king sin against his servant David. And he says, David, has not sinned against you. So I'm going to put over here, pick their friends. He picked his friends over here so that I can erase this. I want you to see how Jonathan does this right here as he relates to Saul. So the first thing he's going to say to Saul is, David hasn't done anything against you. David hasn't sinned against you. He hasn't failed you in any way. He hasn't offended you. So why should you want to kill him? And so he says, he hasn't sinned against you. And actually, the last phrase of verse 4, his deeds have brought good to you. So the next thing he's going to say is that David has actually helped you. He's killed a whole bunch of Philistines for you. He killed Goliath for you. So he hasn't sinned against you. What he's done is actually helped you. Verse 5, he took his life in his own hand when he struck down the Philistine. The third thing he's going to say about David is that he risked for you. So he's doing, what he's doing is peacemaking here. He's the mediator. He's got a friend that he loves, David. He has a father that he loves, Saul. And because he's a man of integrity, Saul said, I'm going to kill David. And Jonathan has taken him. This is not public. This is private. He's not embarrassing the king in front of the court. He's just taking him out and he goes, let's talk about this a little bit. I want to know why you want to kill David, because David hasn't offended you. He hasn't done anything against you. He hasn't sinned. He has actually helped you. Remember, he risked his own life for you. The passage continues, and the Lord worked a great salvation for Israel. So the next thing he's going to tell you is the Lord is with him. And actually the part that scares Saul the most. he says, the Lord is with him. He got salvation for all of Israel. And then he reminds his dad, and when you saw it, he's talking about when Goliath goes down, when you saw it, you rejoice. So David has made you happy. So this is David. He's painting this picture of David to his dad. And then he says this, so he made you happy, you rejoiced in it. Why then would you sin against innocent blood? David is innocent. And lastly, if you do this, you will be sinning. It's a pretty good case. I mean, look at everything he's done. Now, Saul's a grumpy old guy. He's a grumpy old guy that's threatened by David because he thinks he's going to lose it. Samuel's already told him he's going to lose his kingdom. He's fighting against God in that respect. Look at this. David hasn't sinned against you. He's actually helped you. He risked himself for you. The Lord's with him. David's made you happy in the past. He's completely innocent. And if you do this, you're the one that'll be wrong. You're the one that sinned. Now, this doesn't last forever, but here's how it lasts right here. Verse 6. And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. Saul, by the way, Saul's going to say that like 6 times. He's going to be truly bipolar here. He's going to go back and forth and back and forth. But I want you to see what a friend looks like. Everybody in this room has a friend that's messing up, right? Every one of us have at least one friend that's really making bad decisions right now. So what Jonathan gives us is a template for how to talk to that person that's really making bad decisions. Now you can go with this. You're making terrible decisions. See how that works for you. Or you can take this other template, this other methodology, and particularly in his case, he's talking about 2 guys that aren't getting along. The first one is, so what's the big deal? Now, sometimes somebody really did sin. Sometimes there really is a problem that you've got to put together. But sometimes when you say, I know you're not getting along with John Doe, what's the deal between you 2 guys? If it's a long feud, they won't even remember how it started. Or he might say, well, one time I bought a truck from him, and the next week the transmission went out, and he did me dirty. All right, so then you got your starting point. And then you start talking about it. You start talking about transmissions compared to eternity. You start talking about how much you were really stolen from. I mean, in my case one time, I had a truck that went really bad, and then I sold it for $500 more than I bought it for. So God still took care of me, right? I mean, just because other people, and everybody in the room knows this, there are people in the world who try to do you dirty, right? But you belong to God. So he's walking him through this. You guys used to get along. He's actually helped you. Maybe he lent you some money one time. He's risked himself for you. That time that you got bailed out of jail, that time that you were in trouble, he came over, and the time you broke your leg, and he put up the hay for you, whatever the story is. And then he's walking him through this, and it ends with, if you're going to continue to try to get this guy back, you're the one that's going to end up in the wrong. This is a good friend, isn't it? Jonathan's a good friend. We see that all that happens here. Well, Saul makes this promise to Jonathan that he's not going to kill David, but he doesn't even keep it, well, in terms of our Bibles, 1 chapter. 1 chapter later, and so how this goes is David, as a commander, all the commanders are supposed to be at the king's table a certain time every month. It's when the new moon comes in. It's a report time. You come in, you say, this is where I've been, this is what I've done, this is how many Philistines I've killed, this is how many, I need this more rations, I need this many men, this is how many men I lost, these were our casualties. You're doing all of that as well. And David doesn't show up because David knows that Saul wants to kill him. So I'm in 1 Samuel 20 and verse 30. He's asked Jonathan now twice, where's David? Where's David? And Jonathan says he went back to Bethlehem to see his family. Verse 30, then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan. And he said, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't you know that you've chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore, send and bring him to me, for he will surely die. Now, Saul is not really worried about Jonathan's kingdom. He's talking like he is. He's not. He's worried about his own kingdom. He's worried about himself. Jonathan, by the way, I want to show you this in just a little bit. He's wholehearted that David be the next king. He's already worked this out in his own mind. Jonathan answers his dad in verse 32, why should David be put to death? What has he done? It's a continuation of this conversation they had back in chapter 19. When he says, what has he done? Saul can't answer him, so what does he do? He hurled his spear at him to strike him. Now, the moment ago, he says to Jonathan, don't you know if David's alive, you're not going to be the kingdom? Now Saul's trying to kill him. Is he really worried about Jonathan's kingdom? I don't think so. He hurled his spear to strike him, so Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. The Bible has a way of understating things sometimes. Isn't that funny? Jonathan knew, hey, I think my dad's trying to kill David. Yeah, no kidding. Jonathan, verse 34, rose from the table in fierce anger, and he determined to put, because his father determined to put David to death, he rose from the table, fierce anger. He ate no food for the second day. He was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. Now, I want you to see a bunch of things here that are proper. Jonathan is guilty of anger, but that's righteous indignation. That's good anger. Jonathan is guilty, not guilty, he's capable of grief. This is good grief. He's grieving for the right reasons. Jonathan is willing to fast for things of righteousness. He doesn't eat. We read that in this as well. And Jonathan feels shame because of his dad. These are all proper responses. I would just want you to see the kind of guy that this is. Now you read it and it's not, we think of faith and love and bravery. Anger and grief and shame don't sound the right, but they're right at the right times. For everything, there is a season. There's a time to weep. There's a time to laugh. These are all proper responses with Jonathan, and he feels that completely. I want you to turn with me now to 1 Samuel 23, and we're going to run out of time. This morning's Bible study, all about Jonathan. We'll go back and we'll start to weave this story with David again. What we're going to read now in 1 Samuel 23 is the last recorded meeting of Jonathan and David. Maybe they met another time that's not recorded, but this is the last recorded meeting before Jonathan dies. And in this, I just want you to hear, Jonathan. I want you to hear as if you could hear his voice. I want you to hear his tone. I want you to hear his love. Verse 15, 1 Samuel 23, verse 15. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. So David was hiding in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, he rose and he went to David. So I want you to see that Jonathan goes to David. He doesn't wait for David to come to him. David would have had to come to him at great danger and great peril to himself. Jonathan goes to him. Jonathan goes at great danger to himself as well. Look, you've seen enough movies with conspiracy and somebody's trying to kill somebody and espionage and all this. So don't just read this like a Sunday school story. Oh, Jonathan went to see David. No, he had, the whole thing was subterfuge. He had to fake like he was going to go somewhere else. He had to ditch the guys that Saul had followed him. Saul would certainly have Jonathan followed everywhere because he knows Jonathan and David are best friends. So Jonathan's got to go this way, he's got to zig, he's got to zag, he's got to travel at night, he's got to change horses, he's got to get to David without being followed. There's a whole bunch here that I want you to see with this great risk, even sacrifice of what he does, because he's got to see David. So he gets there, and in verse 17, Jonathan is speaking, and verse 16. So Jonathan's son arose, he gets to David, and then here's the phrase, and he strengthened his hand in God. It's Jonathan strengthening David. That's what I want you to see. I want you to see that he's an encourager. That's the next phrase. He encouraged him. He built him up. He strengthened him. He strengthened his faith. I wonder how many people that you know that you would describe them in this way. You would say about him or her, she is an encourager. Here's maybe a way to determine who you might be talking about. How many people do you know, every time you see them, when that meeting, coffee, lunch, whatever it is, when it's over, you leave more energized than when you went? Every time you see them, you are more encouraged. Your faith is stronger. Now, let's just do a little comparison. How many of you people have somebody, and every time you see them, they suck the life right out of you? I mean, whew. You know, maybe it's your neighbor, and you're out working in the yard, and then you see across the yard, here he comes, and you're like, oh. Everybody's got, not just one, everybody's got people who suck the life right out of you, but you don't have very many people who put life in you, who actually, when you get done talking with them, you're always better. You always feel better. Your faith is stronger. In fact, I'm going to go out on a ledge. I want to tell you, however many of those you have in your life, it's not more than 5. If you got 3, you are blessed. Some of you are trying to think of 1. Jonathan encourages David. He strengthens his hand in God, and he says to him, do not fear. Encouragement is the opposite of fear. He takes fear away. David is fearful. We're going to read all about David being fearful. David writes it in his Psalms, in his own diary. He's going to write about being afraid. Jonathan was that guy that when he was there, David was like, you're right, John. I don't have anything to be afraid of. God's in charge of this. Here's what Jonathan says to him. He says, verse 17, don't fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I'll be next to you. And Saul, my father, knows this. There's something else here about Jonathan that I love. A lot of us make excuses for ourselves because our families are really dysfunctional. Jonathan doesn't. Jonathan does not choose to follow the dysfunctionality of his family. He chooses to walk with God. He chooses to be a man of integrity. He chooses to be a loyal, I didn't write that here, I should write it somewhere. His friendship is, he's the guy, He's saying to David, I've got your back. He is loyal as the day is long. Jonathan really only misses one thing in this. It's not a prophecy. It's a dream. It's a hope. He believes that David's going to be king. He only misses one thing. He says to David, he says, and I will be right there next to you. I'll be your number two. Good friends are willing to make themselves the number two. If you've always got to be number one, you're not a great friend. Because you got to be number one. There's a great song that Kermit the Frog sings in one of those things. I'm number one, you're number two. You can look it up. It's really good. But if you're willing in your friendship to take the lesser role, I mean, there's always an Abbott, but somebody's got to be a Costello. There's someone who is supporting. And Jonathan's good with that. He's good at being submissive to David. Well, Jonathan doesn't get to be David's number two. In a final battle, next to his dad, Saul and Jonathan are fighting the Philistines. And because of Saul's sin, battle turns against him. And Saul and Jonathan are both killed in the same day. And there's really no one left in the lineage to be king. David becomes kind of a clear king on that day. And you can take the time. We're out of time this morning, but David grieves for Jonathan, grieves for him, and he loves him like a brother. He said there's something about it. He said that he said it's even greater than a love for women. He's talking about Jonathan. Here's what I want to say to you this morning. I'll bet that, like me, as you read this guy's life, you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, man, I wish I had a Jonathan. Here's what I want to say to you. Don't wait for a Jonathan to come to you. Be a Jonathan. If you will find a David and you'll be Jonathan to that person, you'll have a great friend. Take these characteristics, make these the characteristics of your life. The scripture says, if a man wants friends, he must show himself friendly. You got to be the kind of person that people want to be around. One day, you and I are going to meet Jonathan in heaven. We don't think of Jonathan like we think of Moses or Elijah. But I want to tell you, when you're doing character studies in the Bible, nobody's better than that guy right there.